So, Dr. Lars, we have talked about the Swedish theory of love, and we have also talked about why autonomy is the key to equality. Now, my question to you is, America used to be widely known as the beacon of freedom, opportunity, and independence. But many surveys now show the Nordics are leading the world on these fronts. So, given your long experience of living and working in the US, where have things gone wrong in America? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and there's a lot of similarities really between Nordic countries and the United States. Many, of course, 20% of the Swedish population left Sweden when Sweden was a super poor country, late 19th century. As I said, like 20%, it's a lot of people. And they went there and they both were influenced by America, but they also in turn, of course, right, came with their ideas. And so there's a lot of commonalities when it comes to questions about individual freedom and so forth that unites the two countries. But to answer your question, I think what happened in the US, right, is that in the most recent period, right, from, let's say, the 1970s onwards, we have seen how there's been a withdrawal from what was actually really important for a lot of Americans, namely to come together around certain types of collective endeavors, right? Public school, which was one of the beautiful innovations in the United States that came along with establishing libraries, right? Local public libraries everywhere. These represented what we can call social investments. These were investments directed towards all, citizens. Particularly the education for the young was really critical for social mobility, right? An American dream, right, is all about social mobility. The idea, right, that whether you come from South Asia or Sweden, whether you're rich or poor, America is a land of opportunity, and it's a land of the American dream, meaning, right, not just freedom, but social mobility, not necessarily becoming stinking rich, but making it, right, doing better, right, than your parents and so forth. Right? So these social investments were crucial here. And what has happened, in the recent decades, right, has been a kind of a political reaction against that, right? A greater emphasis on privatization, a lot of expenses involved, right, with education, not the least at university level. When I came to the U.S. In 1970, it was still the case, particularly in California, with a beautiful college system, state universities, University of California system, all the way down to community colleges. So you could enter, right, this sort of ladder of education, which then provided you as an individual with all sorts of opportunities to move on if you worked hard, you studied and so forth, right? Of course, you had to make an effort yourself, right? It was not just sort of money that came to you. Now, so that combined, right, with another problem that doesn't stagnate social mobility in the U.S. is the lack of a functioning universal system for healthcare. Which then means, right, healthcare has become, it's a little bit better in some ways now with the reforms under Obama, but still, right, it's very unequal. And that means that if you and I have a job, for example, and we get good healthcare through our company, which was the case, right, from after the Second World War, then, if we have an opportunity to do something else, we may be afraid, right, of taking that opportunity, taking that risk, because we're afraid of losing health insurance, which of course is very important, not just to you, but to your family as well, right? So what's different here in the Nordic countries, right, is that the social investments, right? Remember, the Swedish and the Nordic welfare state is not about getting money for nothing. Right? This is about investments. You still have to work hard, but you have that fundamental security, which paradoxically, right, allows you to take risks. And those risks, right, translate into a vitality in the economy, innovation, inventions, and so forth, right, that enriches the economy as a whole and provides more opportunities both for the companies but also for the individual citizens. And that is what has gone wrong, in the US. You see, right, if you look at the graphs showing social mobility, right, which again, right, that's the heart of the American dream. You see how they correlate negatively with high rates of inequality. So in the more equal countries, like the Nordic countries, you actually have higher social mobility because everybody, in some sense, are given, right, the tools for, making it as an individual in a market society, right? Because, remember, Sweden is not a, socialist state, right? It's one of the most successful market economies in the world. But for that to function, you need to have investments in human capital, and that has to be universalized, right, through the population to have maximum effect for society as a whole. And that, I think, is a fundamental failure in the US in all of these sectors: education, healthcare, elderly care, critical areas where we need collective social investments to get the maximum, right, vitality in the economy and to spread the wealth, so to speak, and make opportunities for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. And I was looking at the World Economic Forum's, the Global Social Mobility Index report. I think they released it in 2020. So it was the first ever report from the World Economic Forum on social mobility. And you know what? All the 5 Nordic countries, they are at the top. No question about it. And I think then came Netherlands, then came Switzerland. And also, if you look at the World Happiness Report, you get these countries and also the Netherlands and Switzerland at or near the top almost all the time. So I think social mobility is very important. And in that social mobility report in 2020, they put United States at 27th or 28th. I don't exactly remember. And you know what? My country, Bangladesh, they surveyed 82 countries and Bangladesh came up as 78th. So fourth from the bottom, and the United States is 27th or 28th. So if you compare the United States with the Nordic countries, so of course the social mobility is very, very significantly higher in the Nordic country than the United States. Anu also has mentioned this in her book. She has highlighted that America has the American dream, but somehow they deviated from the path that will allow the citizens to achieve that dream. And she also talked about the education and also the healthcare. So these are the critical areas where the United States had actually gone back. So instead of making progress, they have actually, it's about accelerating or decelerating. They said they decelerated instead of accelerating. They didn't go forward. They moved backward. Anyway, so now the critical question.
I think this says, just to add something to it there, that we also see it in terms of another key difference, right? That it becomes more salient, right, when you retreat from these kinds of investment, and that is the over reliance on family, right? I mean, of course, we all have families. We all, like to have that support, and I'm not against families, right? But families don't always work, and they can become a hindrance, and they tend now in the US, right, to function in a way, right, that sort of it gives advantages to those who come from a very rich family background, right, and makes it harder for others. And I think this is something that accentuates also that other key difference between family values in the US versus, individualism in the Nordic case, right? So that this affects not just children, but women, right? All the individuals who tend to be caught in more hierarchical relationships in the traditional family. And I think here the US also, in some ways, right, tends to now accentuate, these disadvantages thanks to the sort of lack of universal investments that earlier offset, some of those negative effects.
Yeah. Now the crucial question, and also my favorite. So let's say if a country or the government of a country wants to design its society according to the values of the Swedish theory of love or the Nordic theory of love. So if they want to, promote these values of individualism, opportunity, independence, freedom, which maybe they do not have right now, but they want to, let's say, replicate or copy something from the Swedish model. So what do you think they should do? What should be their steps?
Well, I mean, this is sort of the big $1 million question, right? That you are asking, and now soon after you've solved this, you're going to become a millionaire and get a number of big prizes. Probably the Nobel Prize will come your way, right? The sad thing is that we know much more about, in a way, going the other direction, right? So, creating a high trust society with a social contract that enables this type of both equality and social mobility, it's easier to destroy than to create, right? And right now in my country, in Sweden, there's a lot of worries about this, right? Because we have our share of problems at the moment, and some of those problems actually come through, right, in my own studies of social trust. But if we are going to at least begin to answer your question, because it is an important question, right? And I think the first thing to do is to recognize that we're probably not going to export, right, a Finnish or Norwegian or Swedish culture wholesale, right? That's just unrealistic, right? I mean, you think of your own country, Bangladesh, right? You can say, oh my God, these are so different places that how can we even begin to have this conversation, right? So I think the most productive way is to go down to a very concrete questions and policies, right, that one might be able to do something about, right? If we look at the question about, let's say, women, right, entering the workforce, right, one reason that these countries have such vibrant economies is because women work as much as men, and that provides all sorts of opportunities. Here, the key piece of legislation was the introduction of individual taxation. Right, that is to say, right, when you do your tax forms, right, in Sweden and the other Nordic countries, you only deal with yourself. Right, there's no idea of the family being kind of the basic tax unit. Right, it's the individual. And that means that there's no incentive, there are no negative incentives, right, to women taking on jobs, the way they might be in countries with a progressive tax rate combined with family taxation, right, where then the husband could argue that, okay, if you start to work, we put your money on top of mine, most of it's going to go away in taxes, then we have to pay for childcare. Right, which then brings me to the second question, right? If you're going to try to create this sort of dynamic economy with opportunities, right, for freedom and social mobility, then you also have to address the question of children, right? Because obviously, you're not going to want to have a society that has a negative effect, right, on childbirth. Look at the horror example of Italy right now, right? Where we see, a real problem, right? Demographic issue in the future, shrinking populations. I mean, we've seen these sort of effects in other countries as well. Japan has stagnated for quite a while. We see it in China as well right now. India is overtaking essentially China in terms of being the largest country in the world. So you have to look at that. And this is where the other big piece of legislation in Sweden was universal daycare, right? As a means, right, to provide both men and women, both with an opportunity, right, to have this double life, being both parents and have a career, which, translates a lot into this sort of happiness business that you like to point to as well, right? So here you have a couple, right, of sets of a piece of legislation that will create, I think, both more happiness and more kind of dynamism. And a related area to this, the same thing happens in Sweden in the 1970s. We changed the law in terms of the big economic responsibility and caring responsibility for the elderly, right? I mean, this is a sensitive issue, right? But, the interesting thing is that in Sweden, we made that shift. Doesn't mean that children don't care about their parents or that the elderly don't want to see their children, but it means that the really heavy lifting, right, is something that we share as a country, as a society. And of course, it also means for those elderly whose children are absent or they don't have any good relationships or they might be dead themselves, are still covered, right? So of course, there's a security aspect for the elderly, but there's also this sense of more freedom, right, for the adult children. So this is another piece of legislation. So these questions, right, around family policy, tax policy, I think are very, very important. And they are concrete, right? You can look at them, right? You see that already. Germany, for example, with a much more conservative view of the family, have started to actively look, at Nordic family policies, right? Because they recognize that, you cannot just simply sacrifice 50% of the working age population if you're going to have a really dynamic type of economy. And also if you're going to attract really valuable immigrants, they will be looking at what are the opportunities here. So there's a lot of reasons to think about these types of very concrete pieces of reform, which means that you don't have to get too lost in sort of a kind of fuzzy talk about Nordic culture or something like that. You can keep it concrete. Tax law, family law, that's sort of one place that you could start.
Yep. And now I will tell you my story, but before I go into that, I have one last question for you. So, the idea of men, usually, at least in my culture, in the South Asian countries, is that the man will be the provider. Protector and provider. So he will provide for the family. But, in the Nordic countries, both men and women work. And I really love this idea. And you have also talked about, because they have this dual life. So they also have their family life. They also have their career. So they don't have to, especially the women, they don't have to sacrifice their career to raise their children after they become moms. So my question is this. Are women in the Nordic countries, okay, let's you talk about your country, Sweden. Okay, so are Swedish women very comfortable with the idea that they also have financial responsibility towards the family? I mean, do they grow up with this kind of values, and are they very comfortable that it's not only the men's job to provide and protect the family, but they also have their part to play? Is it something like that?
It's a great question, and it is more complicated than my story would have it. In fact, right, you have that tendency, but both among men and women, right, to still be attached to more traditional kinds of roles. One of the things you saw early on when it was there was a freedom, right, for the parents to decide who was going to stay at home during parental leave insurance, right, which is another part of the family policy. And then in the beginning, it was almost 95, 98% of the time it was taken by the mother. So later on, we switched the laws to make sure that at least some portion of it had to be taken by the father. Now, over time, we see how the father's percentage is increasing. It's a very slow process because these are deep, tendencies that are probably even genetically in us, as men and women, right? So one has to be respectful here. This is not just something you do like a social engineering thing and change things overnight. You also have right now in Sweden, it's an interesting discussion. There's some women journalists, who just write some articles about, they're sort of slightly disappointed in Swedish men because, they don't seem to be sufficiently willing to, be romantic and pay the bill when you go out for dinner. And, so you hear it is sort of almost amusing. And it's kind of funny, right? Because these are women who are obviously themselves working very hard. And I'm sure, very much gung-ho for gender equality. But they sort of miss some aspects, right, of traditional masculinity. So it was really funny because this woman, she was writing about it, is that, she's thinking about moving to Italy for a while, because she liked to have some dates with sort of quote unquote real men, who sort of act in a more traditional way. So, I think that there is a certain amount of gender confusion here, and people are unsure. I mean, this is particularly, I think, a problem for men, right? Because a lot of these changes have been very positive for women. But we see it very much with immigrant men coming to Sweden, right, from, let's say, the Middle East, with very traditional, right, cultures. They come from Muslim societies, but not only that, they come from family traditions, right? They tend to put women in a very particular place. When they arrive in Sweden, the women often do extremely well, right? You look at Syrian, Iraqi women who've come, many of them here in Sweden, right, in recent years. They tend to do very well. Same ones from Iran, you see these real success stories. But for the men, they lose status, right? And in the Swedish system, they are sort of losers, and we say some pretty bad outcomes now, right, with gang criminality among young guys, right, from these communities, because they lose out in school. They don't see the benefits, right, of the Swedish way. They see the losses, right? But it's not just the immigrants, you see, because your question, I think, is a good one, and it's a subtle issue in some ways. In other ways, it's a very deep issue, right? And it's alive and well here as well. Let me tell you.
Okay, great. So now it's time that I tell you my story. And I have been actually waiting to talk to you for like 4 or 5 years. Ever since ever since I came across the idea in Anu's book. So I was thinking,
Right.
like, okay, she talked to you and she wrote about the discussion in her book, and maybe one day I will get the chance to talk to you, and maybe that I will one day write a book and talk about it. So I don't speak English as fast and as fluently as you do, so maybe it will take a little bit of time for me, but I'm trying to explain to you as much as I can. And I think it's the story I have never told anyone in my life. I mean, broadly, I have never broadcasted this message to anyone. So maybe this is the first time. So it started a long time ago, I think around 2005. Yeah, 2005. So it's almost like 20 years ago. I completed my higher secondary education. So in Bangladesh, it's college. So we have primary education, that's secondary education, then higher secondary, and then you go to university. Mm-hmm. So I completed my higher secondary education, and my result was very poor. I mean, compared to my past records in school, the results were very poor. And in Bangladesh, you have to do really good and good scores in exams. The students actually wear it as a badge of honor because it's a country of cutthroat and very stiff competition. So the school system is very competitive as opposed to the Nordic countries. At least I can say about Finland. In Finland, it's more about collaboration than competition. So I grew up in this culture. So I have always had a focus on studying and, doing good in exams and having good scores. But in that particular year, my higher secondary, and in these countries, these are very high stake tests. So if you are not doing good in matriculation or higher secondary, you have to suffer for the rest of your life because you do not get to get admitted to a good university. You lose that chance. And then if you do not go to a good university, you will have a hard time competing in the job market with graduates from the good universities. So it happened, and my parents were very angry. And my dad actually said he would no longer fund my higher education. And he has an electronics store. So he wanted me to work with him in the store. So it's like, my father is a farmer, and when you were looking for a farmhand to help you in the land. So it was like that. So he was so angry. He said, I would no longer fund your education, and you don't have to actually study because you have already done bad in the exam, and I want you to work with me in the store, and then maybe after my death you will take over the business and you will do that. But you know what? I have never taken any interest in my father's business because I have always loved stories and these kind of things. But this is what I wanted to tell you. When he said this, I was like 17 years old, and it actually hit me very strongly. So I was emotionally very upset. And that was the point since when I have had my relationship with my father completely strained. So this particular incident affected me and had such a great psychological and emotional impact on my life. And I didn't think much about it, because in Bangladeshi societies, they will tell you always about like, you have to follow your parents, and you have to what they say, you have to just follow, you have to take their order. And it's kind of the idea established in this society that parents can never be wrong, and they have all the rights to tell you and to do whatever they want with you. Right. And this is the thing. After I came across your theory, the Swedish Theory of Love, I actually understood why it happened. You know what? I mean, still these days, after 20 years, I do not have a very comfortable and good relationship with my father, because whenever I talk to him, my mind goes back to that incident.
Right.
And I feel like, you know what? I mean, he had the power, he had the money. And if you do not have them, I mean, as a 17-year-old Bangladeshi, you actually do not have anything. You do not even have your own apartment. I think in Sweden, the young people, they leave their parents' home at like 18 or 19. But in Bangladesh, you know, it's a completely different culture. So you even stay with your parents when you are like 28 or 30, when you are even married. So you live with your wife and the parents.
Yeah.
But that was the incident, you know, I mean, that was the key moment. And I want to tell you something really interesting. In the book, The Nordic Theory of Everything, so Anu quoted you. So she was talking to you on Skype from New York, and you are in Stockholm or so, or somewhere in Sweden. So she said, you told her, in the US, there is both a moral and to some extent legal expectation that parents provide for their children even after the children have come of age. But this expectation also means that parents have power over their children. You know what? When I read that sentence, I understood what happened to me and what happened between me and my father. When my father said, I don't want to fund your education anymore, you know what? I was helpless. And I couldn't say, okay, if you don't want to fund my higher education, you don't want to spend money on my education, I will do it myself. You know what? In Bangladesh, you cannot do it because as a 17-year-old, nobody will give you a job. The economy and the culture and the society and the labor market doesn't work like the Western countries. So we have a different system. Even after, you know, going to university, having our graduation and post-graduation, many people are still struggling to find a decent job. I mean, they are getting a job, but the payment is not good. And it's still, of course, it's not that easy in this economy and this country to get a job. And when I read the sentence that if my parents are funding my education, they have power over me. And that's why that day, after 20 years ago, my dad could tell me that I won't fund your education. You know what? This is the example of what type of power a parent can have if you are dependent on them. And you know what? I mean, finally, after heavy negotiations with my parents, I could finally manage them to fund my education. And also I couldn't go to a public university. And in Bangladesh, if you do not go to a public university, you go to a private university. And the tuition fee is really, really high, you know, markedly high compared to the public university expenses. So my parents actually spent a lot of money on my education. And you know what? If they didn't do it at that time, maybe after 20 years, I would not be talking to you. I would not be a journalist. I would not be a writer. Maybe I would be working with my dad still in his store. My life would have been very, very, very different. And these unspoken incidents are part of love in Bangladesh. I mean, they will tell you that because your parents are funding your education, they give you accommodation, you know what, they pay for your health care. So that means they love you, and that's why they are actually doing it. And you know what I call this is this. I call it a complicated system of interdependence that is a ticking time bomb. And that bomb actually went off in my life. You know what? For the first 16 or 17 years in my life, maybe that bomb didn't go off. It didn't explode. But after completing my secondary education, when I needed money to go to university, then I realized that actually it's a time bomb. And if you are dependent on your parents for your education or any other aspect of your life, then you are actually at the mercy of your parents. And if they say, no, I'm not going to fund your education, or no, I'm not going to give you this, you are in serious trouble. You are in deep trouble because you cannot move forward. It's not like, as I said, Bangladesh doesn't work like the Western countries. So young people do not have that much power to influence their lives. They actually depend on their parents. So this is the story of my life. And then when I went to Finland, so I still have this very good friend. She lives in Oulu, the northern city of Oulu. And she was also trying to get to the university. She now studies at Helsinki University. So when I was talking to her, she was actually trying to get admitted to the university, and not even once did she tell me that this admission process or this stage of her life depends on whether her parents are willing to give her money or to fund her education. Because, we are talking about Finland, where everyone has the right to get free education or almost free healthcare. So then I realized, if I never went to Finland, I could never understand the power of this Swedish theory of love or the Nordic theory of love, how these things work. But now, because I understand this, I really feel good that I understood the problem. What they say is love in Bangladesh is actually a mess. It's a complicated mess of dependency. Instead of promoting independence in Bangladesh, we're actually promoting interdependence on family or spouses, relationships, romantic relationships. So that's why we have these problems. And after I read the book, The Nordic Theory of Everything, and also your book, The Swedish Theory of Love, I understood the problem. And now I can say that in Bangladesh, we have this problem because we have that dependency structure. So if we want to solve this problem, if we want that a young man or woman will be able to fund his or her education without being dependent on his or her parents, then you have to have a system like the Swedish theory of love, so that the young people can actually depend on themselves instead of depending on their parents.
It's so interesting to hear, because the original inspiration for the book, for me at least, was precisely this question of student loans, right? And I think I've been explaining this in various interviews, and I think it's in the preface of the book as well. And I think also it's interesting because one of the earliest reforms, right, that sort of speaks to this whole idea of the Swedish theory of love, was the reform of the support for students, right? That is to say, removing, right, the responsibility of parent or spouse, which is prior actually to the reforms of the tax system or family policies in general. So you're spot on. I think you're capturing, it's a wonderful story. Aside from, I understand the pain also here, because, I always tell people sometimes, the thing is, we always assume that parents love you and that the family is about love. But it's very hard, to handle power that's dressed up as love, right? Because that means you sort of have to reject your own parents, which nobody wants to do that, right? But the fact is that love and power, right, they are mixed in these relationships between family members, and particularly between parents and children. So your story, really speaks directly. It's a wonderful story, and I thank you for sharing it, because I can understand this was not an easy thing for you,
Exactly.
And
exactly.
I was a typical Nordic person. I just sort of left, And
you know what? I have the plan to go back to Finland for masters, and I really want to meet you, and then we can talk about this again and again.
Absolutely.
And a lot, because 30 or 40 minutes is not enough to have the discussion. And also my idea about marriage also changed because of this Swedish theory of love or the Nordic theory of love. But I don't have time today to talk to you about this. Maybe we'll talk about this in person if we met someday in Sweden, or maybe we'll set up another meeting when I will tell you more about these kind of things. And also I have plans to write articles comparing this Bangladeshi theory of love and the Swedish theory of love.
Wonderful. I love that. I love that.
Okay, so that's the thing. But anyway, Dr. Lars, I don't want to continue this meeting today anymore. So we have talked about a lot, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure, and it's kind of a dream come true for me that I could talk to Mr. Lars Trägårdh, who actually changed and influenced my life in many ways that I cannot even tell you today. But anyway, it was actually, I got very emotional, so I shouldn't continue this meeting anymore. But anyway, Dr. Lars, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. All right.
Yep. Okay, goodbye.